doesn't it? Some parts of Scripture make it appear like a near relative of milk and honey. Surprisingly, manna got its name from a question the Israelites asked when they first discovered it on the ground of the desert. They asked something like, manna, which we would translate into English as, what is this? Manna was God's response to the people's grumbling against Moses and Aaron. That's the opening scene in our first reading from the book of Exodus. God's response to the grumbling people in the desert would provide a model for the gospel stories of Jesus' miraculous sharing of food among crowds of thousands. The scene in our first reading opens with the whole community grumbling against Moses and Aaron. Saying that the people were a community subtly underlines the fact that until God and Moses got involved with them, they were not a community at all. They were just slaves in Egypt. God sent Moses to lead them into becoming a community who could live in the freedom of God's chosen ones. Their protest was therefore much more than a question of rations. They were in effect questioning the whole Exodus enterprise, including the possibility that they could be a people of God. They were not simply mistrusting Moses, but the very God who had called them into being as a people on the road to freedom. God's response to their complaints begins with a quote from their recent past. I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. People who know the Exodus story hear that as an echo of how it all began. Exodus 2 tells us that when the Israelites groaned under their bondage, their cry for help went up to God, and that God told Moses, I have witnessed the affliction of my people and have heard their cry. The God of Exodus is the God who hears the cry of suffering people and does something about it. But God is not a nanny who jumps at every whimper. God promised to sustain his people, but that sustenance would test their faith as well. God promised them their daily bread, the manna, and told them to trust that it would be there. They were to gather it one day at a time, believing it would be there the next day as well. The lectionary skips the details of God's instructions that the people were to gather only enough for the day, and that whether they gathered much or little, each family had just what they needed. On the sixth day, they were to gather for the Sabbath as well. But if on any other day they had leftovers, the food decayed before they could use it. That was God's way of teaching them that hoarding only feeds the worms. The food God provided came from a very natural phenomenon. A certain kind of lice punctured the fruit of a particular tree and drink the sweet juice, eventually leaving a substance that flows and congeals and then can be eaten raw or cooked so that it resembles bread. Manna became shorthand for the bread God gave them, bread they would eventually call bread from heaven. One of the things we should remember from this story is that creation is the first and foremost ordinary expression of God's providence. We don't have to seek out miracles. God's plan is sufficient from the start. The manna kept the Israelites going. It gave them nourishment, but more importantly, it served as a sign of God's constant care for them. With the manna, they were able to continue the journey toward becoming the chosen people of God in the land God wanted to give them. Strange as the manna first appeared, its story evolved into a classic and cherished legend of God's providence. The people ate the bread day after day until they arrived in the Promised Land. In the process, they grew in gratitude for what it meant as much as they appreciated how it arrived and how it tasted. They came to realize that the manna, and the quail as well, were not just food, but signs, what we call sacraments, of God's care for them. The more they acknowledged that, the more their eating became a communion, a way of receiving and taking in God's love. Eating that bread would transform them. Because it's always easier to appreciate miracles and grace in hindsight, the people of Jesus' day loved their 1,000-year-old memory of the manna and shared the hope that it would happen again in the time of the Messiah. That's where Jesus in our gospel tried to help them delve deeper into their religious imagination. He wanted to help them understand the truly human meaning of what he called the bread of life. If they desired to participate in the experience of their ancestors, they would have to learn not only to look to the past or hope for the future, but to see what was right in front of them. Jesus said, "It was not Moses who gave the bread from heaven. My Father gives you the true bread from heaven." While it was easy for them to remember the manna they thought had appeared miraculously for their ancestors, they had forgotten that the great sharing of bread that motivated their search for Jesus began with a child who gave everything he had for Jesus to share with the crowd. One of the key challenges John's Gospel gives us is the call to recognize the gifts of God in our midst. The people who meet Jesus in this Gospel are always looking for great things and seem unable to realize that the marvels they seek are right in front of them. They need only believe in order to perceive them. John's Gospel brings the past into his present, showing the fulfillment of the desert story in Jesus. Last week, we heard that in Jesus' presence and with his blessing, thousands of hungry people ate their fill. Then, rather than let them turn the event into a circus, Jesus snuck away. Today, we hear what happened when the crowd found him back in Capernaum, where they could buy or bake their own bread. At home with them, Jesus led the people to questions about the quality of their lives. In the desert, their hungry ancestors had encountered the love of God, would they be content with the sustenance they could find in a bakery? Or did they long for more? When Jesus offered true bread, they responded, "Give us this bread always." His answer, "I am the bread of life, I am the living bread," was not what they were looking for. Instead of promising a free lunch, Jesus was inviting them to be nourished by his life, to assume his way of being as the path that would bring them everything they could ever want. The miraculous sharing of bread they had happened among them offered the key to understanding Jesus' offer. When one child gave all he had, they saw that those who share everything will never hunger. If they wanted to do the works of God, if they wanted the food that endures, they needed only to believe in Jesus enough to do what he did. Jesus' sharing of himself as the bread of life illustrates the greatest potential of human life. The Son of God entered our history not to wow us with miracles, but to show us how we can live, as Paul suggests to the Ephesians in our second reading, as new selves, people truly renewed in spirit. We who love the stories of Jesus can and must take responsibility for them by making them come true in our own day. Perhaps we might take today's readings as an invitation to look at the stuff of our daily lives, the ordinary, the surprising, and even that which originally appears less than attractive, and ask, what is this? The gospel tells us that God is constantly in the process of giving life to the world. Like the Israelites, we are invited to keep moving on our journey of faith. We are called to go along together as a community, seeking and praying, looking at the reality of our world and asking, what is this? Sincerely asking that question in community will lead us to discover the manna God keeps sending. When we share it, we discover that it is the only bread that satisfies the hungers of our world.